November 8, 1942. Bidala Beach, Morocco. 043 hours. Private First Class Jack Thompson hit the sand running, his boots sinking into the wet North African shore as tracer rounds cut through the pre-dawn darkness above his head. The landing craft behind him was already reversing, its ramp closing, the coxswain desperate to escape the French colonial machine gun fire that was turning the beach into a killing ground. Thompson clutched his rifle, the M1 Garand, and scrambled toward the seawall, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. 30 yards to his right, a Wehrmacht advisor was directing Vichy French troops from behind a concrete pillbox. The advisor had seen amphibious assaults before. Poland, France, the early days in Russia. He knew how they worked. Defenders with bolt-action rifles could hold a beach against superior numbers if they maintained disciplined fire. Aim, shoot, work the bolt, aim again. 5 rounds in the magazine, maybe 6 if you were German with a Mauser. The math was simple. Rate of fire determined who lived and who died on a beach at dawn. Thompson threw himself against the seawall, breathing hard, tasting salt and cordite. Around him, other soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division were taking cover, pressing themselves into whatever protection the beach offered. Most were green. This was Operation Torch, America's first major offensive in the European theater, and for many of these men it was the first time they'd been shot at by someone who wanted them dead. The machine gun in the pillbox traversed left, then right, searching. Its muzzle flash was a strobing orange star in the darkness. Thompson could hear his sergeant, a veteran named Morrison, who'd somehow survived Bataan before being transferred to the North Africa operation, shouting orders that were barely audible over the chaos. Suppressing fire, keep their heads down. Thompson rolled onto his side, brought the Garand to his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked once. The buttstock punched his shoulder. Not painfully, but firmly, the gas-operated action already cycling. He didn't have to work a bolt, didn't have to break his sight picture, didn't have to move his hands from firing position. He just aimed and fired again and again. 8 rounds in the en-bloc clip, each one available as fast as he could pull the trigger. Semi-automatic. Self-loading. The future of infantry warfare packed into a 9.5-pound piece of walnut and steel. The German advisor behind the pillbox noticed something wrong immediately. The volume of fire coming from the beach was impossible. The Americans had landed maybe 40 men in this sector. He'd counted the landing craft. 40 rifles should produce sporadic fire, each soldier needing 3 to 4 seconds between shots to work the bolt action. But the incoming fire was continuous, overlapping, a rolling thunder that forced his French colonial troops to keep their heads down instead of returning aimed shots. Thompson emptied his first clip, 8 rounds in perhaps 6 seconds. The distinctive ping of the empty en-bloc ejecting from the receiver was lost in the noise, but he felt it, heard it in his hands, if not his ears. Already he was reaching for another clip from his cartridge belt, pressing it down into the receiver, feeling the bolt slam forward as the rifle loaded itself. Ready to fire again in less than 3 seconds. Morrison was moving along the seawall now, directing fire. And Thompson saw what the sergeant was doing. The Americans weren't trying to hit specific targets in the pre-dawn gloom. They were creating a wall of bullets, suppressive fire that pinned the defenders and made it impossible for them to acquire targets and deliver accurate shots. And they could sustain it because they didn't have to stop shooting to reload after every 5 rounds. 40 yards up the beach, a Vichy French soldier made the mistake of rising above his sandbag position to aim his Lebel rifle, a bolt-action design that dated back to 1886. He got 1 shot off before 3 American soldiers saw the muzzle flash and engaged simultaneously. The Frenchman worked his bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge, trying to cycle another round into the chamber. The Americans fired 18 rounds in the time it took him to chamber his second. He dropped behind the sandbags and didn't rise again. The Wehrmacht advisor was shouting now, calling for the machine gun to shift fire, for his troops to concentrate on specific sectors. But the math had already turned against him. In a firefight between bolt-action rifles and semi-automatic rifles, the side with semi-automatic weapons could deliver 3 times the volume of fire. Maybe 4 times if the soldiers were well trained. And these Americans, green as they were, had trained extensively with the Garand. They knew its manual of arms the way a pianist knows scales. Thompson was on his 3rd clip now. 24 rounds downrange in less than 30 seconds. His shoulder was starting to ache from the recoil, but his hands were steady, his breathing controlled. The rifle was doing exactly what John Garand had promised it would do when he designed it back in 1936. It was making 1 American rifleman equal to 3 or 4 enemy riflemen in terms of firepower, delivered on target. The sun was starting to break over the horizon, turning the sky from black to deep blue to orange. In that growing light, Thompson could see the pillbox more clearly now, could see the muzzle flash of the machine gun, could see French colonial troops moving behind their defensive positions. Morrison whistled, 1 short blast, and the fire team shifted their aim point. All 5 soldiers, all 5 Garands, concentrated on the pillbox's firing slit. 40 rounds in 10 seconds, the bullets sparking off concrete, ricocheting through the narrow opening, making it impossible for anyone inside to man the machine gun without catching a round. The machine gun fell silent. Morrison didn't wait. Move, move, move. The sergeant was up and running, and Thompson found his legs carrying him forward before his brain had fully processed the order. The entire fire team was advancing, covering the 40 yards to the pillbox in a running crouch, firing as they moved. The Garand let them do that. Let them maintain suppressive fire while advancing, something that would have been suicidal with bolt-action rifles that required you to stop, work the action, aim, and shoot. They reached the pillbox. Morrison tossed a grenade through the firing slit, while the rest of the team pressed themselves against the concrete walls. The explosion was muffled, contained. When they swept around to the entrance, the French colonial troops inside had their hands up, surrendering. The Wehrmacht advisor was dead, caught by shrapnel. On his belt was a holster containing a Luger pistol. In his hands was a Mauser Kar 98K rifle. 5 rounds, bolt action, the standard weapon of the German infantry. It was an excellent rifle, accurate and reliable, but it was already obsolete, and its former owner had just learned why. The beach was secured by 0600 hours. As Thompson sat on an ammunition crate, cleaning his Garand with a pull-through cord, Morrison came over and sat beside him. The sergeant's hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline wearing off. "You did good, kid," Morrison said. Thompson nodded, not trusting his voice yet. Morrison looked at the Garand in Thompson's hands. "That rifle just changed everything," the sergeant said quietly. "Every army in the world is going to want one now. They just don't know it yet." Morrison was right, though it would take the rest of the war for the full implications to become clear. The M1 Garand represented a fundamental shift in infantry tactics that most military theorists hadn't fully grasped when it was adopted in 1936. For centuries, infantry combat had been constrained by the rate at which a soldier could reload and fire his weapon. From muskets to bolt-action rifles, the limiting factor had always been the manual operation required between shots. The Garand eliminated that constraint. For the first time in history, an ordinary infantry soldier could sustain a high rate of accurate fire without needing to manipulate his weapon between shots. The tactical implications were profound. Before the Garand, military doctrine emphasized marksmanship, making every shot count because you couldn't afford to waste ammunition when your rate of fire was limited by mechanical action. Fire and maneuver tactics required careful coordination because advancing soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles couldn't maintain suppressive fire while moving. The advantage typically went to the defender, who could prepare positions and deliver aimed fire at attackers struggling to return fire while advancing. The Garand inverted these calculations. American infantry squads discovered they could advance under fire because half the squad could maintain continuous suppressive fire while the other half moved, then switch roles. The volume of fire from 8-round semi-automatic rifles was sufficient to keep enemy heads down, preventing the accurate aimed fire that made frontal assaults suicidal. What had been a defender's advantage became an attacker's opportunity. By 1943, American infantry tactics had evolved around the Garand's capabilities. The standard rifle squad consisted of 12 men, each armed with a Garand except for the squad automatic weapon gunner. That meant 11 semi-automatic rifles capable of delivering 88 rounds before anyone needed to reload, and reloading took only 3 seconds with a practiced hand. Compare that to a German squad with 8 Kar 98K rifles delivering 40 rounds before reloading, with each reload taking 5 to 7 seconds while working the bolt between each shot. The Americans could deliver twice the volume of fire and sustain it for longer periods. German after-action reports from the Italian campaign in 1943 and 1944 repeatedly noted the overwhelming volume of American small arms fire. Wehrmacht officers, trained in the doctrine that had conquered Poland and France, found their tactical assumptions failing against an enemy that could maintain fire superiority with standard infantry weapons. The Germans compensated by increasing the number of machine guns per squad and emphasizing defensive positions, but these were reactive measures to an opponent who had fundamentally changed the nature of infantry combat. The Pacific Theater told the same story with different terrain. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and 100 other islands whose names became synonymous with brutal close-quarters fighting, the Garand proved its worth in jungle and urban combat, where engagements happened at ranges under 100 yards. Japanese soldiers, armed primarily with the Arisaka Type 99 bolt-action rifle, found themselves outgunned in the sudden encounters that characterized Pacific Island warfare. An American Marine could put 8 rounds downrange in the time it took a Japanese soldier to fire 3, and in the chaotic environment of jungle fighting, that difference meant life or death. The rifle earned its reputation through stories that spread through the ranks like battlefield legend. On Iwo Jima, a Marine named Tony Stein stripped the M2 Browning machine gun from a wrecked Navy fighter plane and carried it into combat, but when it jammed, he picked up his Garand and held off a Japanese counterattack long enough for his squad to reorganize. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, but he credited the Garand with keeping him alive. "That rifle never quit on me," he said. "Not once." General George S. Patton called it the greatest implement of battle ever devised. This from a man who loved tanks and believed in mechanized warfare above all else. But Patton understood that tanks couldn't hold ground. Only infantry could do that. And infantry armed with Garands could hold ground against superior numbers because they could deliver superior firepower. During the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, Patton's infantry kept pace with his armor precisely because they had the firepower to quickly overcome resistance and keep moving. The Germans knew they were outmatched. Captured Wehrmacht soldiers routinely spoke about the American rifle with a mixture of respect and frustration. One German infantryman, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, told his interrogators that facing American infantry felt like facing a unit that had twice as many soldiers as actually existed, because the volume of fire was so overwhelming. German weapons designers scrambled to develop semi-automatic rifles. The Gewehr 43 was their answer. But by the time it entered production in significant numbers, the war was already lost. Too little, too late. The Soviets, despite receiving massive quantities of American supplies through Lend-Lease, never received Garands in significant numbers. Stalin's factories were producing millions of Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifles and PPSH submachine guns, weapons that fit Soviet tactical doctrine of mass infantry assaults. But Soviet soldiers who encountered American troops in the brief period when both armies met in Germany in 1945 noticed the difference immediately. One Soviet officer wrote in his diary that American infantrymen fought like they each had a personal machine gun, and he couldn't understand why the Red Army didn't have similar weapons. The answer was economics and industrial capacity. The Garand was expensive to manufacture, about $85 per rifle in 1943, compared to $25 for a Kar 98K, and even less for a Mosin Nagant. It required precision machining, quality steel, and tight tolerances. Most nations couldn't afford to equip their entire infantry force with such a sophisticated weapon. But the United States, with its massive industrial base and economy untouched by strategic bombing, could afford it. American factories produced approximately 5.4 million Garands between 1936 and 1957, with peak production during the war years reaching 600,000 rifles annually. That industrial capacity mattered because the Garand's true advantage wasn't just individual firepower. It was sustained firepower multiplied across an entire army. One soldier with a Garand was impressive. A squad was formidable. A division was overwhelming. When every American rifleman from Normandy to the Philippines carried the same semi-automatic rifle, it created a cumulative advantage that no other army could match. The Wehrmacht might field superior tanks and the Luftwaffe might have jet fighters, but the basic infantry soldier, the man who actually occupied and held territory, was outgunned every time he faced an American counterpart. The rifle's reliability became legendary. It functioned in the desert heat of North Africa, the freezing cold of the Ardennes, the humid jungles of the Pacific, and the mud of Italy. Unlike some semi-automatic designs that jammed or malfunctioned in adverse conditions, the Garand's gas-operated long-stroke piston system was robust and forgiving. Soldiers could drop it in mud, submerge it in water, or go weeks without proper cleaning, and the rifle would still fire. This reliability was crucial because infantry soldiers in combat don't have time for weapons that require constant maintenance. Thompson carried his Garand through North Africa, Sicily, and into Italy. By the time his regiment fought its way up the Italian peninsula toward Rome, he'd fired thousands of rounds through the same rifle he'd carried off that beach in Morocco. The stock was scarred, the finish worn, but the action was still smooth, still reliable. He'd replaced the barrel once, at the armorer's insistence, not because it had failed, and had gone through dozens of en-bloc clips. But the rifle itself had never let him down. On a cold morning in January 1944 outside Anzio, Thompson's squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire from a farmhouse 200 yards away. Morrison was dead. Killed 2 months earlier at Monte Cassino. The new sergeant, a kid from Ohio who'd been in country for 3 weeks, was frozen with fear. Thompson took command without thinking about it, directing fire, coordinating movement. They advanced by squads, one group providing covering fire, while another moved, classic fire and maneuver. The volume of fire from their Garands was sufficient to keep the German machine gun crew from maintaining aimed fire. They covered 200 yards in 10 minutes and took the farmhouse with 3 casualties. A German sergeant they captured, a veteran who'd fought in Russia, asked through an interpreter what kind of machine guns the Americans had been firing. When told they were standard-issue rifles, he shook his head in disbelief. That was the Garand's legacy. It made the impossible routine and turned ordinary soldiers into formidable infantry. It didn't make men invincible or wars bloodless, but it gave American soldiers an edge that multiplied across millions of individual firefights into strategic advantage. When historians analyze why the Allied powers won World War II, they point to industrial capacity, logistics, strategic bombing, naval superiority, and code breaking. All true. But on the ground, where wars are ultimately decided, it often came down to firefights between small groups of men with rifles. And in those fights, the side with Garands usually won. After the war, the rifle continued in service through Korea, where it proved its worth all over again, in a different kind of warfare. It wouldn't be fully replaced in American service until the M14, and elements of Garand's design would influence every semi-automatic and automatic rifle that followed. The AK-47, the M16, every modern military rifle owes something to John Garand's insight that infantry weapons should be self-loading, and that soldiers should be able to fire as fast as they could pull the trigger. Thompson came home in 1945, his Garand left behind in a depot in France to be refurbished and issued to another soldier. He'd carried it for 3 years across 2 continents. It had kept him alive through a dozen firefights and countless close calls. When asked years later what he remembered most about the war, he didn't talk about the beaches or the battles or the friends he'd lost. He talked about the rifle, about the solid weight of it in his hands, about the confidence it gave him, knowing he could put 8 rounds downrange faster than any enemy could respond. About the distinctive ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting, the sound that meant you were empty but still alive to reload. Greatest battle implement ever devised, he'd say, echoing Patton. That rifle won the war. Not by itself, but it sure as hell helped. He was right. In the end, World War II was won by logistics and industry and strategic vision, but it was also won by millions of individual soldiers in thousands of small unit actions. And in those actions, the M1 Garand gave every American rifleman an advantage that turned the tide of countless battles. It was the weapon that changed infantry combat forever, and the soldiers who carried it into battle knew they had something special in their hands, something that gave them a fighting chance when the shooting started, and lives hung in the balance of who could shoot faster and more accurately. The Garand delivered on both counts, and in doing so, it earned its place as one of the most significant weapons in military history.